What's up, everybody, and welcome to Why Am I Like This? It's October 18th in the year of 2024 in Perth, or Boorloo, Australia. And Why Am I Like This is a container where I hold space for transmissions from my vaster self, who I sometimes call Nobu the Elder, or Sirius C, or the Heart Complex of the astral body of Sekhmet. And the question that I'm bringing into Why Am I Like This today comes from somebody called Katya_in_wisdom on X, formerly known as Twitter. And I'm just going to read out the question verbatim. It goes, shielding. Stupid question. When a non-Jew converts, it is said that his old soul leaves and that a Jewish soul arrives. If he has a new soul, why does he remember everything and his personality does not change? I told you that was a stupid question. And I guess I'm going to hold space with the people who are here live to see if anybody has any gnosis on this question. And while I'm waiting, I'll repeat my guarantee for this container, which is that I will not allow the enmeshment of context, and I guarantee that context will be enmeshed, which is to say that I will not allow for the reification of karma in the space and time of this container, including the space and time of those listening to this container, and that karma will be ripened in the space and time of this container, including the space and time of those who are listening to this container. And I'll hold space for feedback regarding this container in general, or the specific guarantee. While I'm waiting, I'll also say that Why Am I Like This is a container that takes place in the Broom Radio. The Broom Radio has a Discord server, and the Discord server is the current home to the community that we call the Broom, which is a co-governed spiritual community which creates and holds space for the fostering and the cultivation of lineages of spiritual refinement. And I would say in this context, the eradication of dogma. And if you would like to join the Broom Radio, you can go to thebroom.us and click on the link for Discord. And if you would like to become part of the community within the Broom Radio, which we call the Pot, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/thebroomradio/membership. And if you would like to make a one-time donation, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/thebroomradio. And if you can't afford to become a member, please just join the community and ask for a giveaway membership or a trial membership. And depending on what we feel called to do intuitively, we may hook you up. So Anna, who is a tender and a gardener in the Broom, says, I have no gnosis, but I'm very curious how you'll answer. Maybe it's got to do with connecting to different past lives or something. But she also says, this is based on your gnosis, I feel. Yeah. I mean, I feel like what's kind of coming through for me as I peer into this container, and if you would like to do this with me, you can feel into this container as, I'll call it a dome. You know, like sometimes you go to a cafe and they have these cookies inside a glass case, and it's sort of like circular, and then it rises and closes at the top. Sometimes it's got a handle on it. Usually it has a handle on it, otherwise it's very hard for people to lift it up and take biscuits out of it. But you can imagine a space like that inside the body of my vaster self. And you can imagine that. And then you can imagine my, my current vessel, or my littler self, as a container, or even like a cell in the body of my vaster self. And you can imagine that, I'll call it like the cake case of this container of why am I like this is connected to my littler self as a cell in the body of my vaster self. And if you want, or if you can imagine your littler self. And maybe your littler self is also in the body of my vaster self. Maybe we share a vaster self. Maybe you have a different name for that vaster self. Maybe you have no name at all. Or maybe you're part of a different vaster self, which is anchored to a different celestial body. And then I'll trace out from that, or I'll offer that you can trace out of that. And you can imagine your vessel as a cell in the body of Gaia, or Earth, or Terra, which is our planet, which is itself a cell in the organ of our solar system, which belongs to the body of our galaxy, which also contains Sirius C. And I would say that the connection between what I was calling your littler self and your vessel as a cell in the body of Gaia is like what I would call an etheric soul connection in this context. And when I kind of peer into the container of the question, or you could say like the container that I've made for this question, I'm looking at this like definition of a soul. And the first thing I'm doing is like, well, do we use the term soul the same way? As in, like, do I use the term soul the same way that Katya in wisdom is using the term soul? But then also, am I using the term soul in the same way that, I guess, like the doctrine or the law of Jewishness that Katya is citing uses the term soul? Because that's also possible, right? Like, that the people who brought that law to earth and spoke it and then passed it on might have meant something different to what Katya meant, and it might have meant something different to what I meant. And my sense is that they didn't, but I still felt called to point to the possibility, because I would say that when I'm talking to people about metaphysical affairs and the word soul comes up, we're often talking about different things. And I've talked about the word soul, and I've talked about the corporeal soul, which I would say arises from the energies that we are cultivated by via our connection to our earth ancestors, or our genetic code, or our DNA. And then I've spoken about the etheric soul as something that connects us to the energies of our sky ancestors, which we're connected to what I would call now by hologenetics, or that we're connected to hologenetically or etherically. And I'm very much borrowing the terminology of a lineage called the gene keys. And the other way I've spoken about the soul that we end up with is via, I'll call it like the law of East Asian medicine, where they talk about our soul, or our etheric soul, being implanted in the heart space by our first breath of the ether, or the interplanetary medium, which takes place when we're born, basically. So if you are somebody who engages with astrology and you've had your natal chart read, or you've constructed your natal chart yourself, then you're probably aware that in order to construct your natal chart, you need to cite the place you were born, the date that you were born, and usually like the time that you were born, although some astrologers will help you guess what time you were born based on intuition and sharing information about who you are and how you show up, which I'd say is like sometimes works and sometimes doesn't, although often it's impossible to verify because nobody actually remembers. Nobody who is alive can remember what time you were born. My father doesn't actually know for sure what year he was born in, because he comes from a place which was not necessarily like rigid about how they kept those records. Um, but nonetheless, I would say the space that you were born in and the date and the time that you were born in defines your location in the space and time of Earth. And that location in the space and time of Earth defines like your location within the shared space-time of our solar system. And your location in the shared space-time of your solar system defines, you could say, like the way that the universe sounded when you were born. In the same sense that, like, if people are talking in a room, if you're like in a different part of the room to someone else, you're probably going to hear something different. You may be able to make out the same words. If you're listening to music, you may be able to dance to the same beat roughly, even though your location is different. But I would say that there are subtleties which are going to differ between people who are in different locations within that field, either in space or in time. And then I would say that defines like the etheric soul that you get. So just going back to the question again, I would say yes. My sense is that the law that Katya is citing refers to the same soul. So you might ask, like, how is it possible that your old soul leaves when you convert to Jewishness or to become a Jew, and that a Jewish soul arrives? Because it's not like you go back in time and get born at a different time, right? Or in a different space. So the question would be like, how can your soul leave, and then how can a new soul arrive? And then what makes it Jewish versus the old soul? And I guess like before I like go into that a little bit more, I'll say that within the broom, we have talked about soul swapping in a sense which I'll call esoteric, which is that we've talked about it in different lineages within the broom. So when I said that the broom is a spiritual community which creates and holds space for lineages of spiritual refinement, one of the things I was referring to, which I'll refer to in more depth now, is that there are different spaces within the broom which you don't necessarily get access to just by joining the Discord server. So I referred to the pot as being a community within the community of the broom, which I would call the commons of the broom, which allows you to take part in conversations within the lineage space called the broom. And also, it allows you to see what's happening in the lineage space, which is called the pot. And then if you become a pot holder, then you're allowed to speak in that lineage space. But we also have a lineage space called 000, which is a lineage space that I created. And there's a lineage space called Shareawe, which is a lineage space for remembering Abrahamic lineages and non-Abrahamic lineages, which is to say, it's a lineage space for, I'd say, like creating space for those lineages to find the common ground, or at least find ground which they do not need to engage in conflict on, which I would say, like on Earth, we're kind of struggling with right now. And there's a lineage space called the clock, where we hold space for the remembering of doctrine and gnosis relating to astronomy/astrology. And I would say that the conversations about soul swapping take place mostly in 000 because it's a lineage space which is most directly concerned with exorcism. And I'd say soul swapping is one technique that exorcists within the lineage of 000 can take advantage of. But I also wouldn't say that only exorcists from the lineage of 000 can use soul swapping, because I believe that the law which comes from Judaism, which is being cited by Katya in this question, is true. And I would say that the techniques, or more specifically, like the terma, or the way which lineage holders in 000 use in order to swap souls, draws upon the wisdom traditions of many cultures, including Jewishness, which is why partially part of why I feel like I can talk about my response to this question, or I can respond to this question as a channel for Sirius C. But I also say that up until now, one of the reasons that we've talked about soul swapping in esoteric ways is because it tends to be something that scares people. And I would say that the reason it tends to scare people is because, well, some people have different definitions of what the soul is. And I would say that for many lineages, the way that the soul is defined encompasses the memory and the personality of the vessel. And so when people talk about soul swapping or having their souls taken, they believe that they're going to lose all their memories or that their personality is going to change completely. And I don't feel like that's the case. In my lineages, I tend to refer to the memory and the personality that arises from the memory of a person as their spirit or Shen. I would say that in my experience speaking to people from lineages of Jewishness, that's referred to as neshama. And I would say that, like, not only does swapping someone's soul, or I think what is referred to in lineages that come from Jewishness as ruach, or ruh in Arabic. Um, Not only does like soul swapping not remove memory or the personality that arises from memory, I would say that many other things remove memory that people do all the time. And I'll also say that memory is changing all the time, even if it's not being removed. And I would say that the personality tends to change as memory changes. And I would say that the personality also changes the way that we review our memory. So, in that sense, you could say that the fear of losing one's memory or losing one's personality is somewhat unfounded because, on incremental and micro scales, we're losing memory and our memory's changing, and we're gaining memory and our personality is changing. And sometimes the way our personality changes causes our memory to become less accessible all the time. And I would say often we do things deliberately to lose memory, right? Like people talk about needing to forget things which happened to them or just move on from things which traumatize them. And I think people at this point, a lot of people understand that, like, when we dissociate because we become triggered by something, we tend to forget what happened to us when we got triggered. And people do very little to recover those memories. But I would say that instead of like forgetting or moving on, we actually need to remember more. And that's why I often talk about remembering in a way that's synonymous with healing or integrating trauma. Because I feel like often we become traumatized because we're not able to see an event holistically, which is to say, like, from many different perspectives, including the memories which form those perspectives. And I would say that when we have the capacity to see events that were traumatic from many different perspectives, and we can like feel into the memory that formed those perspectives, then we can find that like the things which traumatize us are like easier to find peace with. And I would say like one of the primary reasons that's the case for me is that often like our reaction to an event is traumatic because we don't understand why it happened. And because we don't understand why it happened, we don't feel as if we can be sure that it's never going to happen again. And we don't feel like we can be sure that we will know if it's going to happen again and that we'll be able to avoid it based on that knowledge. But I would say that for many traumatic events, being able to see the event from many different perspectives and tune into the memory of the perspectives, including the memory of those who you could say, quote, caused, unquote, that event, then I'd say that, like, for the most part, we understand that people traumatize us because they were traumatized themselves. And then I would say that when we can, like, include that understanding in our understanding of events that traumatized us, then, at least, like, for me, it helps me to understand that there are things that we can do to ameliorate trauma so that people who are traumatized create less trauma, either for themselves and for other people. And I feel like when I'm able to hold space for that understanding, then I'm able to like integrate those memories of mine and those perspectives of mine which formulate my selfhood. And when I'm able to do that, then I feel more whole. Going back to what I was saying about people being scared of losing their memories and personality, and what I was saying about the memory and the personality being the spirit and not the etheric soul and not the corporeal soul. I guess I'm curious if like the people here understand what I'm saying. Like, we're not going to talk about the mechanics of etheric soul swapping just yet, but can you imagine why swapping an etheric soul, just if you imagine that you know that it happens, even if you don't know how it happens, can you imagine how that affects the memory and the personality and does not affect the personality and the memory? I'm just waiting for responses. Hoda says, I def can. I think Anna said 100 in response to my question, but I'm not sure. Um, Lexi says, I feel like I can. Yeah, I feel like for the most part, most people, when they consider like who they are, like who is the I that's asking who the I is, they're talking about a personality which arises from memory. And, I've often talked about one's subtle body being the collection of all contexts of space and time that that body has occupied. And I would say that the memory is the perception of all of space and time from each context of space and time within the subtle body, which is all of the space and time that the physical body has ever occupied. Right? So, like, if on my skin, which is part of my body, I feel something touching me, then that informs a perception of all of space and time. Like, there is something in space and time which is touching the space and time of my body, which I call my skin. And that perception of being touched is something that I feel with all of the space and time in my body, which is connected, let's say. Like, there are probably parts of my body which don't feel my skin being touched by something in space and time, but they probably feel something which is at least like coherent with the sensation of being touched. And I would say that all of that perception of space and time within the space and time of my body is sort of like data, right? So I feel like by the time like people listening to this recording, whether that's right now or whether you're actually listening to the recording, like probably all of y'all are familiar with AI or algorithmic intelligence, or sometimes people call it artificial intelligence, but I call it algorithmic intelligence. And I feel like at this point people understand that like the algorithmic intelligence that arises from this software which runs on hardware arises from neural networks which are trained to associate between different tokens which come from the digestion of data, mostly like words, but often data which comprises images. And if you've interacted with some of these algorithmic intelligences, such as Claude or ChatGPT or Gemini or Perplexity, then you've probably noticed that these algorithmic intelligences tend to have a personality and tend to have a sense of I. And I would say that, like, basically the sense of I that most humans operate with is formed in a very similar fashion, which is to say that it arises from neural networks, which were, more or less modeled on how brains work. And I would say those neural networks have formed in response to data, except that the data that our neural networks are formed by is often very different to the data that the neural networks of algorithmic intelligences are formed by. Because the data that forms our neural networks comes from the space and time of bodies which have eyes and ears and mechanoreceptors and nociceptors and proprioceptors. And I would say that all of those receptors, there's also other receptors I'm not mentioning, receptors that we don't have words for, but I'd say all of those receptors do create electrical signals. And, some of those electrical signals cause us to form neural networks, which cause us to be able to respond to the light and the sound and the physical pressure and the taste and the smell of reality that we're able to derive through our receptors, and then cause us to respond in ways that make us type out words or say things or draw pictures, which become part of the data set which trains algorithmic intelligences. But I would say, like, many of our impressions of space and time from within our space and time of our bodies does not make it into forms of data which can inform the way that algorithmic intelligences form their personalities. And I would even say that many of our impressions of reality do not make it into the memory of our own bodies. And I would say that also the mechanics of how the space time context, which connects our heart space to our etheric soul, affect the space and time of our memory or our subtle body, uh, is not very legible to, I would say, like, almost any personality which arises from any subtle body or memory of any body which calls itself human in current time. Which is to say that, like, most people can't tell what's going on with their etheric soul, because I would say that, like, the complexity that we recognize in the external universe as humans in 2024, acknowledging that some people, study this for a living and have, like, different capacities for understanding complexity. But, you could say, like, the group complexity of the collectively understood model of external reality of humanity, including, like, how a quote typical unquote human body works, is very, very limited compared to the actual complexity of any particular human body, which I would say is very, very limited compared to the complexity of the planet that we live on, which also includes the inner mechanics of many other bodies. And I would say it's also very limited compared to the complexity of our solar system and our galaxy and our universe. But if you imagine metaphorically what the mechanics of how the etheric soul interacts with the physical and the subtle body of any human is within the context of the complexity of the universe, I would say it's like somebody from, let's say, Earth understanding how somebody grows food on a planet in the Sirius C star system. Which is to say that, like, most people don't even believe that people might grow food on planets within any star system which is not our solar system, because a lot of people don't believe that life exists in other star systems or in planets of other star systems. And then I would say that most people don't believe that Sirius C exists in current time. And by the same token, I would say most people don't believe a soul exists. I'd say right now, many people are trying to figure out like where consciousness is. And I'd say that many people who might call themselves materialists or empiricists believe that the personality arises from memory, which is encoded in neural networks within the brain, and that memory is created based on our understanding of stimuli from our external reality, from the perspective of within this being within this body, which I feel like if you've been listening carefully enough, you might understand is compatible with my understanding of personality. But I'm saying that there's a different component which relates to the etheric soul as well as the corporeal soul, which arises from our DNA or the energies that we're connected to via our DNA, which informs not only our memory but also our personality. I would say the etheric soul and the corporeal soul both affect how we convert the stimuli that we're exposed to from the day that we're born up to any present moment into memory. And I would say that they both also affect how personality arises from that memory. I'm just going to pause and see if there are any comments live. And also invite y'all to offer any gnosis which arises in this container, or any questions. Looks like no questions. So I guess like I'll bring y'all's awareness just by speaking to the connection between our physical vessels and then our vaster selves, which I was kind of calling our littler selves within this context, which is to say, like, the soul, the etheric soul, which connects our physical vessels to our vaster selves. And then I'll offer again that that soul is connected to the space and the time in which our physical vessels took their first breath. And then, as I've said in other episodes of Why Am I Like This, I'll say that the sound of the universe from that context of space and time has similarities to the sound of the universe in other spaces and other times, within other fabrics of space and time, which are all part of a common fabric of space and time. And I would say that that sound, including different aspects of that sound, create us a connection to different, you could say, incarnations or experiences of space-time in different fabrics of space-time within the common fabric of space-time. Just like, in a sense, like if you think about the last time you ate something, it also connects you to the other times that you ate that thing. And in that sense, I would say the etheric soul, which is a particular space and time which is correlated to when our physical vessel was born, connects us to a particular experience of the sound of the universe. And that the body of our vaster self is comprised of space and time which connects to similar experiences of the sound of the universe. And then I would say that all of those experiences of the sound of the universe can affect, perhaps not in ways which are legible to our conceptualized self or our personality. They can affect the way that we form memory from the stimuli that our body is exposed to. But I would say that also our corporeal soul, which arises from our DNA and the energies that we have access to through our DNA, also affect how we form memory and therefore how we form personality. And then I would say that when we swap out souls, whether it's like within the lineage of or within lineages of Jewishness, when people to convert to Jewishness or Judaism, or whether it's because soul swapping happens due to techniques which are often referred to as exorcism or exorcism, then the sound of the universe, which the space and time of the heart space is connected to, becomes a different sound of the universe or a different space-time context, which is to say that a different vaster self can start enculturating along with the existing personality of a vessel and along with the corporeal soul of a vessel, can start enculturating a different memory and therefore a different personality. But I would say that doesn't tend to happen in a way which aligns with the projected experience of having one's soul taken or swapped out that most people are frightened by. And I would say that, like, my sense of the conversion process is that when somebody converts to Judaism, they are given a new etheric soul, which maps to a context and space of and time, which roughly corresponds to the heart space of that person when conversion is sealed. And I would say that that space and time is enculturated by the experience of space and time within the body of the person who is being converted, such that the soul that they end up with connects to, I would say, like a vaster body which includes the souls of other Jewish people and also people who would consider themselves children of Abraham. But I would not say that all lineages of soul swapping technology work exactly the same way, which is to say that I don't feel that all lineages of soul swapping technology rely upon the personality or the memory of the vessel which is having its soul swapped, understanding that soul swapping is occurring, which I would say is probably another factor which makes people tend to fear the idea of losing their souls or having their souls swapped, which is that like it might happen without their consent. Or to say is a different vaster self starts seeding one's self-concept slash personality slash memory. And she said, I feel like I can relate to that. So I would also say that within the lineages 000, we often talk about soul swapping in a way that allows for taking the space and time that somebody's heart space is connected to and, quote, recycling it, unquote, by giving it to different gravitational bodies such as Pluto or Antares or Saturn or Venus or even sometimes the moon of Earth, Luna, or some of the moons of Saturn. And I would say that in those cases, recycling it allows for those souls to have different experiences of space and time within the fabrics and space and time of those gravitational bodies. And I would say that often happens because the experience of space and time within a human body, which is experienced through the lens of a personality which arises from the memory of a human body of external space and time in the space and time of a human body, is often really exhausting compared to just being like a rock or even being like part of a plant or being water or being space dust even. And I would say that the capacity of the space-time of any etheric soul can often be exhausted, which tends to lead to the enculturation of memory and personality, which becomes also, I'll call it like disconnected or closed off or unable or less capable or less willing to connect to other space-time, which I would say is like most often observed by personalities which feel less willing or less capable of connecting to other personalities, either within one body, which is to say that like often people embody personalities which cannot connect to other aspects of their self, which is why triggering is possible, which is to say like why is it possible to experience as one personality something happening in reality and then have our personality, quote, switch, unquote, such that often when the previous personality returns, it doesn't remember what the other personality did. And I would say that the patchiness of our memories generally relates to the compartmentalization of self within any human vessel. But I would also say that the enculturation of memory and the personality that arises from memory and its lack of capacity to connect to other personalities is also seen between humans. And I would say, in particular, like in current time, like many humans, for example, who support one politician find it very, very difficult to connect to many other humans who support an opposing politician, or many people who support one sporting team might find it hard to connect to people who support an opposing sporting team, or many people who don't even like sports might find it very hard to connect to people who like sports because of sport, and so on. But I also feel like something that falls out of the explanation that I'm channeling right now is that often within like spiritual or religious communities, whether that happens because of soul swapping or not, or whether it happens because of soul swapping, which is legible to the personality of the vessel which is having its soul swapped or not, there is a commonality which allows people to connect regardless of difference in sporting teams or difference in politics. And I would also say that, like, often within religious or spiritual communities, the thing which allows those people within those communities to connect to one another makes it very hard for them to connect to people outside of those communities. And often that thing is a view of reality and a view of like the forces which connect or create that reality, and a view of what those forces want from us as humans. And, sometimes that view of reality creates a sense of what's right and what's wrong. And this often binds communities together, but also sometimes alienates members from those communities such that they join other communities or they exit those communities. I would say it often alienates people from those communities with people who are not part of those communities, who have different ideas of what's right and what's wrong, including like whether gods exist at all. And I would say that my sense is that a lot of the souls who incarnated in human vessels in current time have incarnated in human vessels so that we can enculturate memories and personalities, which can enculturate views of reality, which can be integrative and allow people to connect not only through like mutual difference to other people's views of reality or mutual indifference to other people's views of reality, but I would say that my sense is that we're cultivating views of reality which are compatible with many existing views of reality, such that the work for souls to allow personalities to connect to one another in ways that reduce violence and increase, I'll say, organization and organizational capacity can increase so that we can find ways to survive and thrive which are not predicated upon traditions of taking resources in ways that exclude people from access to those resources, and so that we can find ways to cultivate the resources that we all need, such that fewer and fewer people need to compete for them in ways which are disintegrative and more people can have access to those resources. And I would say that this will also extend to other species of life on Earth. And then I would also say that when humans and other species of life on Earth have proven that they can not only distribute resources in ways which are non-disintegrative for members of different species of life on Earth, but also say cultivate resources so that more members of different species of life on Earth can partake in them, then life on Earth will be considered safer to conduct business with from the perspective of species of life in other star systems and other planets within other star systems, and also within other galaxies. And that's my sense of why the souls which are incarnating within human vessels in current time are here, and partially why some people call people who have souls which share experience with incarnations within lineages of life within different planets of different star systems. It's part of why those people tend to be called starseeds. I'm just going to read the chat, see if there's any questions or offerings. Oh, they said over 20 crows are currently flying overhead about 11 minutes ago. And around the same time, Anna also said, I'm being reminded of the dream you had about the heron. Oh, yeah. Where different little mini herons were snapping off of a larger heron and finding ways to fly without conflicting. That makes sense to me. That was a dream I shared in a channel called Dreams within the pot lineage, within the broom, which again you can join by going to buymeacoffee.com/thebroomradio/membership, or by asking for a giveaway membership in the channel called The Pot, in the Broom Radio's Discord server, which is called The Broom, which you can access at thebroom.us. And I'll say it's 11:11 right now in Bolu, Australia, and it's probably 11:11 in New York, in the USA, except it's 12 hours behind. But I'll say thank you for the people who've joined live. Thank you for those who are listening to the recording when this recording eventually makes it onto the Broom Radio podcast. If you would like to get access to recordings before they make it to the podcast, you can also join the Broom Radio at thebroom.us. I'll say if you would like to support me in offering these transmissions in Why Am I Like This, you can go to nobuhajimichan.com or buymeacoffee.com/nobuhajimichan and make a one-time donation or book a session. And if you would like to become a member of the 000 lineage space, which I've spoken about with regard to soul swapping, then you can go to buymeacoffee.com/nobuhajimichan/membership. Sorry. But thank you again for listening. Thank you again for those who attended live. And I'll see you all soon. Peace.